That picture was from about 40 years ago, as you can tell. I call it my banker picture. I'm going to say yes to your loan. See if I can get this. It's not on yet. There it is. Well, something's moving. Back up to the beginning. Back up, back up. There you go. Keep going. There you go. One more. All right. A slightly newer picture. Thank you, Shanae, and it's good to see all of you. This is one of my favorite conferences, and I see we have a great crowd this year, partially because it's such an important topic, and we have a new administration, so we're obviously extremely interested in some of the new directions, which is one of my topics. You'll notice up there I say 9 News, KOA, Denver Post. When I started with 9 News, there was Ed Sardella and Mike Landis. That's how far back. Bob Martin was on KOA. Colorado Politics, which is now online, was called The Statesman. Some people way back there on that. I put it up there just to remind you that today, if you want to communicate to the public, you've got to be online, you've got to be on radio, you've got to be on television, you have to be in print. The media is so fragmented today that for your own agencies and your own advocacy, you have got to be very much following the electronic trends today. Notice the buzz. You'll see that referred to in here several times. Because that's where I post almost every day and where you can find a lot of the slides and material. I want to start a little bit with the midterm because that really has shaped not only what you're watching in Washington right now, for example, the shutdown, but also the politics of Colorado that came out of the midterm election. Trump felt the wave. I'm not sure he's beginning to understand what it means in terms of divided government. The economy was not enough. Frankly, if it was just the economy, I think Republicans would have won, and he would be at a 50 popularity, and he's at about 40. His image hurts him, and I don't see many changes yet, so he's still pretty much committed to really working with his base. And as you can see, I argue, and many others do, that that's probably not enough, that you're not going to be reelected with about 35%. So we'll see how that works out. Voters sent a message. They essentially wanted checks and balances. They wanted to see a change. And in Colorado, we had a second wave. And that wave was an incredible number, record number of voters, in which a tremendous number of them were new voters, including unaffiliated voters, young voters, women coming out and running, and a huge, again, record amount of money in this race, primarily on the Democratic side. And so that was a sort of a second wave. Everything that happened in Washington was then reinforced and accelerated here in Colorado. We said no on state taxes, but you'll see in a minute we were incredibly generous locally. And Democrats, as you know, now have a vertical control, and they have to be cautious with what we all refer to as overreach, but on the other hand, they are going to try and implement many agenda items that they haven't had a chance to do for a number of years. For those of you who have heard me do this, this is called the dashboard. It's my quick look at. I use it with students to put in place what I think governs much of our politics, and that is presidential approval. That's what that election was all about for the most part. The president's approval is in the 40s. As you know, most recently it dropped down to 37, 36, 38. And that's causing him a lot of trouble on the Hill. I think it's irritating him just in general, and it was mostly because of the shutdown. He has been within a very narrow band. He seldom goes below 38 or so. He seldom goes above about 44. But you're watching one of those moments when he has been lower. Notice he's got a 50% people rating him, approving him on the economy. Well, if they were just judging the economy, he'd be at 50%, and he's not. So that is a significant part of his problem. You'll notice we're still not all that happy with the direction of the country. Interesting, I just finished a poll in Arapahoe County, and 69% of the people, the residents of Arapahoe County, said they were satisfied with the direction of Arapahoe County. And the message for that, from that for, I think, you, is that at the local level, and it's turned out to be true in most of the polls I have done for the Water Congress, at the local level, whether it's with water districts or municipalities, they are incredibly popular. And so that you can do things locally that you simply can't do either at the state level or certainly federally in terms of going to the electorate and asking them for, say, more resources. This was Chuck Todd, NBC's Sunday host, and he started with the, he went through college educated, and then I went down further, but he was making the point, his point was that Colorado is no longer a swing state. I turned it into a question. I don't think that is totally determined at this point, but if you look at those numbers, we are above the national average for Hispanics, for example. They're voting overwhelmingly Democratic. We're above the national average of college educated, and I think most of you have read or heard about that. That's a group that doesn't like President Trump and have been voting overwhelmingly Democratic. There's the women, which I put in. Those are from Colorado surveys. There's unaffiliated. They were 34% of the electorate. One of the biggest blocks in the electorate in this last midterm election. They voted 20% for Democrats, which is one reason why there was that sweep, and Polis won by 10 percentage points, as did the entire Democratic ticket. There's millennials. I am a baby boomer, kind of at the older end of it. So, 1946 to 1964, baby boomers are now about 37. They're down to about 19. There's 75 million of them, and they are pouring into this electorate. They are more liberal than my generation, and I was a lot more liberal than, say, my parents. And so that is a transition that's going on, and they voted substantially in this election. I suspect they're going to turn out in the presidential election, too. Now, here's the challenge for Republicans locally, and that is that Cory Gardner, as you know, is up. And when you look at that, the coloring in that little graph there, these are federal elections. But George Bush won 2000 by 8 points. Then he won 04 by 5. But after that, there's no other Republican that's won at the presidential level. And with the exception of Cory in 14, there are no Republicans that have won at the Senate level. And so the challenge that he is facing is that he's running with Mr. Trump, who by and large gets about 43% in Colorado consistently, and he is running in a state that has shifted to some extent. So that's his challenge. As you see, he won by 2 points. Now notice I say he fights to survive. Who was one of the first people to come out against the shutdown in the Republican Senate? Cory Gardner. And he got a lot of kudos for that from sort of independent forces here. The Denver Post, which endorsed him, if you can remember, 5 years ago. And when the Denver Post endorsed him for Senate, that was probably one of the biggest events that took place in that election, helping him and angering the Udall forces. So he's definitely going to fight for this, but this will make us one of the most important battleground states, and watch him. Because what he's doing is probably his best judgment on how to hold a seat in a swing state. So it'll be very, very informative to watch him. As you know, there's a little coming and going in Washington. There's the Secretary of Interior. There's a lot of acting secretaries. The president says he likes acting. He didn't say why. I would argue they're easier to fire. They don't write nasty letters like Mr. Mattis. They don't have confirmation. And as you know, the president pretty much runs the government by tweet in the White House. He was quoted during the shutdown as saying, "How can there be chaos? I'm the only guy here." Good question, Mr. President, but it does reinforce that he is the person who is largely in charge here. As you know, we don't really have press secretary or press events very much anymore because he's sort of out in front of it. Mattis was his biggest problem and is still a major problem. He was at a dinner the other night and got in Washington, and got an incredibly long standing ovation. Very, very respected person, and but many of these other people have been dismissed, and there's just a lot of changes in Washington. So that's on the presidential side. Then there is the legislature now with Nancy Pelosi. That was the coach she had on after that first meeting when the president said, I will take credit for the shutdown. And he kind of regretted it and tried to get out of it, but basically everybody stayed with that. Okay, you're in charge of the shutdown. You're in charge. And that coat became extremely popular. They sold out of it at one of the stores that was carrying it because she was seen as a hero among a lot of people on the Democratic side or resisting the president. I have been calling for, and in front of this audience, in front of you in the past, that she should retire. After she lost the chairmanship or the speakership in 2010. And she simply defied me. Nancy stayed and stayed and stayed. And I have known her over the years, and she's always been impressive. Well, this time I changed my mind, and she listened to me. I did an interview right after the election, and as you know, there was a lot of pressure to get rid of her, and I said, no, you ought to, this is the year you ought to keep her. There's all these new people. You need somebody aggressive with experience, and she listened. That's what I think. This is the Baltimore Sun. She's from Baltimore. But in any event, she stayed. I think the party agreed, and she won the vote overwhelmingly. Trump said, I'll take the blame for the shutdown. He got it. Over 50% of the public said, you're at fault. He said, unfortunately for him, a majority of the people don't support the wall. They support all kinds of other things in terms of security, but not necessarily the wall. And then his support began to decline. He was hoping that Democrats would break because he kept hearing Democrats talking to their constituents who were out of work and who were complaining, and they would say things locally, oh, we've got to end this, I think we've got to find a compromise, et cetera, et cetera. He was hoping. Instead, Republicans broke. And so when the final vote came on the day that the day before he backed off, Republicans, Mr. McConnell, doing everything he could, he lost 6 votes, including Corey. Democrats, only one Democrat broke on the Republican bill. That and the fact that LaGuardia shut down and the entire air traffic control system was going to shut down backed off of that. In my opinion, this is going to linger for quite a while. As you know, we're debating it right now. But just in general, I think that was a misjudgment on his part. Primarily because not understanding how painful shutdowns are and how the media covers them, and that is people are out of work, people are not getting their checks, they're not getting their benefits. And secondly, it's a reflection of this new reality in Washington, again coming from that midterm. This is now a divided government. There are now checks and balances. And finally this year, so there's the Congress, I showed you the White House, and then finally there's a presidential campaign running out there. There's probably going to be about 20 Democrats. I think there's 9 officially right now who are high enough up to get people to put them on polls. That picture there is from the very first Republican debate. So it's not too far down the road for the first Democratic debate. It's going to be in June, but that Republican debate was in July, or what have I got? August 6th in 15. That was the Megyn Kelly debate, if you remember. The president, notice he's right in the middle, Mr. Trump, of that picture, and because the polls said he had maybe about 12 or 13%, and the Republicans closely watched and followed the polls, whether you got on that stage, 10 people. You can see Mr. Christie is just hanging on over on the left side. You know, pretty good sized guy. That chair should not slide off of there or he'd be in trouble. And there was Mr. Kasich on the other side. Well, that's how they did it. The Democrats, of course, being more fair in their mind, they're going to do it randomly. I'm not quite sure what that means, but they will seat people on and I assume they're going to have maybe 2 stages also, or do it over a couple of days because there is a tremendous field. The most important person, at least at the moment for us maybe to watch, is the governor. Will he declare? You know, he hasn't. We sort of assume he will, but he hasn't done it yet. Can he make that first June debate? Will he raise the money and have the credibility to get up there and be on that debate? I kind of assume he will, but I don't think that's certain. Then can he make Iowa 1 year from right now? He thinks Iowa is his breakout state if there is one. He's sort of hopeful about New Hampshire too. Who can say? But that is the test. Notice my final bullet there. I point out that Mr. Trump could win. This is a different election. This will be a choice. And so the Democrats, if they have a terrible candidate, then obviously, which is one reason why they're so nervous about Mr. Schultz getting in it, the Starbucks gentleman, multi-billionaire, because they know they could lose that race. Mr. Trump could win, even though he is on the defense right now. Let's talk about Colorado. A trifecta, control of both houses of the legislature and the governorship, and then, as you know, they came in with such a sweep. Wayne Williams was taken out. Mr. Brockler lost. The treasurer is a Democrat, and it's a lot of responsibility. But for those of you who remember '74, that is when the Democrats for 2 little years took the House of Representatives, and then from then until the late 90s, it was entirely controlled by both houses by Republicans. I don't think that'll happen here. I think the Democrats are going to be in charge for a while, but nonetheless, these things move back and forth. But that was a year in which Gary Hart, who had just run the world's worst presidential campaign for George McGovern, beat Peter Dominick, a seated, very potent senator here. Tim Wirth came in as a congressman. Dick Lamb became the governor after beating the Olympics and establishing his reputation. So it was one of those years. Well, that's what this was. This was an earthquake type of year, and in some ways, because Wayne Williams lost, the Democrats in '74 didn't win the Secretary of State's office. Notice how deep it went also. It took out county commissioners that had been around a long time or were running in seats that they had controlled, Republicans had controlled. In Arapahoe County, an incredibly good sheriff lost to somebody who didn't run much of a campaign by 20,000 votes, the incumbent sheriff. The incumbent clerk, who was considered one of the best Republican clerks in the state, lost. And then you can go around, and probably in some of your counties, the same thing happened, some surprises, and Democrats came in. So that was one of those deep, and that's what I call the second wave that came through because of the power of the Democratic forces working with the wave that came out of Washington and the desire to send a message to Mr. Trump. I mentioned, notice how it begins to shift slowly but surely toward the Democrats, but it's been balanced periodically. At the beginning, it was mostly Republicans when Bill Owen was in. Those are who controls the legislature there. And I went with presidential or non-presidential terms, off-year elections, which we just had. There was some switching back and forth, obviously, in presidential years. But nonetheless, it gives you the sense of the direction. And I would just point out that second bullet there, changes in partisanship and demographics. When Bill Owens was in, there was about 140,000 Republican edge in statewide registration. Today, there is a 40,000 edge for Democrats in registration. And registration is not everything. There's people don't necessarily vote how they're registered, and there's unaffiliated voters. But it gives you an idea of what those bases out there have changed. So the Republican Party is now overwhelmingly playing defense and must win unaffiliated voters with really good candidates and the right messaging. Notice down there the new movements out there. In '74, if you remember, it was the environmental movement. It was the anti-war movement. Today, it's the Me Too movement. You can think of other things, maybe anti-gun that motivated some people. Health care, big issue out there. And finally, we had some incredible amounts of money in this race. There were multi-million-dollar Senate races out in Jefferson County. Jefferson County had one of the highest turnouts in the state, and it's not the biggest county out there because of the fact that there was so much money spent encouraging so many people to vote in those Senate races. On water, Mr. Polis, and it was mentioned with our legislators, that basically the governor in his State of the State had one paragraph on water, but it was the right sort of paragraph. For those of you who have worked to try and get something in the state, you are so proud to get a paragraph. That is a long paragraph, so Mr. Stolp and everybody who worked on that probably feel pretty good about it. Notice how he linked water to agriculture, which was one of the big messages up here, particularly from our East Slope representatives and West Slope, and that is that if we're going to protect water agriculture, and we're going to deal with this gap, then we're going to have to do a variety of things, and at least some of it's going to be storage, but it's all going to have to be good management. So I think that, and we're about to hear from Mr. Gibbs and the Attorney General and Ms. Greenberg. But generally, as I say, this is considered sort of a positive statement, and it took a lot of work for folks to no doubt get it in that speech. We said generally no. We said Democrats came out gangbusters or unaffiliated and voted Democratic. But we generally said no to everything on the ballot, with a few exceptions. For those of you who are still using payday loans, we've now capped your interest. No, I don't see much reaction, but we did that. But we didn't do much else. We have changed how we do reapportionment in the state. But we basically said no to taxes for schools, no to setbacks, no to takings, no to taxes for transportation, no to bonds for transportation. So we generally said no. I have a little list up there as to why I think that happened. We tend to trust and like our local government. Remember I said Arapahoe County and water districts, and we generally don't trust state government. And you might say, well, the people that were trying to raise money for schools and for transportation were actually independent interest groups, but generally speaking, that money was going to go to the state. And so there's just a lower level of distrust. You're feeling that it's a sort of a parochialism, and that is, well, that's just going to benefit Denver. That won't help us. Is the West Slope going to get all this money or some of this money? And how about the East Slope? So we begin thinking very quickly of how it's divided up. I don't know if you noticed that ballot. The blue book, for those of you who read it, and I know there's people out there who read it, it was 45 pages, not counting the judges here in Denver. And that's pretty much universal because Denver had its own blue book, which was not short. And so one of the things I argue is that all these voters that came out, many of them knew they weren't coming out to micromanage the state budget like we think we like to do periodically, yes to this, no to that. They were coming out to send a message to Washington. And they pretty much ignored or said no to the rest of the ballot. On the other hand, they were extremely generous at the local level. And that's, again, a message, I think, for water. And that is that for those of you who are, whether it's rates or whether you're talking about taxes, for those of you who have to deal with taxes, property taxes, bond levies, et cetera, we were universally, with very few exceptions, positive about school district property tax elections and as you bond, whether it's bonds or schools. You'll notice urban drainage there, including some fairly conservative counties like, for example, El Paso and Douglas, Larimer, and others. And Jen, specifically for water, this was, in my opinion, the model for those of you who are thinking there's got to be a campaign in this state to see if we can fund the water plan. This is a sort of a model to think about. They took over $1 million out of their general treasury and spent it in advance of the election to tell people what urban drainage did. A few of you knew before that. Well, many of you would remember the ads. And they were good ads, and they put them up. And then, of course, the campaign, they did them mostly the year before or early in 18. And then they shut that down and went into the campaign. Look at that ballot language. The first time I looked at it, I said, gosh, this looks like GoCo. Is this Great Outdoor Colorado running for something? In other words, urban drainage is providing trails, wildlife habitat, recreation. In other words, they're doing things, and you all, in many ways, do many positive things when you're going out, and water itself is easy to sell, the urgency of it, the need for it, quality and quantity, so that I'm just suggesting to you that this is a model to look at. Notice it passed Arapahoe County, who we keep thinking, is kind of a conservative Republican party, county, and the answer is no, it's not. It is definitely shifted, not necessarily in every election, but in many of them. But as you can see, it carried every place but Adams, and there it got close. Let me mention what I think is one of the biggest issues in the state, and that's growth. It mainly plays at the municipal level. Obviously, you deal with it because you have to catch up and keep up with the growth in your communities, and that causes you some stress. But it's also causing a lot of mayors and city council stress. I just gave a presentation to Lakewood, and that's what's on their mind. The mayor of Denver, if he has a political problem, I would say it's primarily due to just sort of aggravation about growth. So all these mayors are dealing with it. Notice we're seventh. Denver alone is 700,000 citizens. It grew 100,000 citizens in the last 8 years. It provided 18% of Mr. Polis's vote. The overall metro area, which has grown like gangbusters in the last decade, provided 65% of his vote. So the politics of this state, to some extent, has also shifted because of our intense urbanization. Now, there is a good piece of news for those of you who are thinking of running for Congress, and I know we've got some potential candidates out there. We're going to have a new seat, probably somewhere in this metro area, but it'll make a difference in every seat, because to come up with the 700,000 voters to put in the new seat, we will take some voters from every seat, so all the geography is going to change to some extent. You can see the states that are winning. We're one of them. Texas gets 3, Florida 2. States that are losing, you're going to be surprised. New York, Pennsylvania, Ohio, Illinois, Michigan. States, in my opinion, that have not been very attractive in terms of their economies, and maybe in some cases their politics, but certainly their economies. Denver, as I mentioned, has been growing. Core cities don't grow. The Clevelands, generally speaking, don't grow very much. The St. Louis's, the Pittsburghs, the Buffaloes, those cities in those states, and yet Denver has grown and done well. It's irritating for people who are there, but it is also quite beneficial. Almost done. And I won't go through all of this, but just take a quick look at it, because I think these are these top 4, for example, are issues that we're going to see, and these are trends. This is not just the people that were just elected, rather it's the long-term trend in which, for the most part, they're in alignment with, to some extent, and that is there's sort of an anti-growth mood out there. The last time we were this sort of anti-growth was in 2000. If you remember, we put a ballot initiative on. It lost due to a lot of work from the development community, but it was an initiative to limit growth in Colorado, and you're seeing a lot of discussion of growth limitations in various communities. We're not going to get the Olympics. We're not going to get Amazon. Do you see anyone stressed about that? No. We're not going to get it. That's fine. So that's sort of a sign that we're sort of tired of growth right at the moment. We could use a pause. Anti-hydrocarbon has been growing and growing, and we periodically get angry with the extraction industries. It's usually related to worker rights or toxins or some a lack of paying enough taxes in our mind, or whatever it is, and that's happened since our founding as a state. But the anti-hydrocarbon movement has been around for some time. It has now kind of become an ideology. It is linked to climate change. So you can expect to see a lot of legislative and maybe even ballot initiative or activity on that. We passed marijuana commercialization in 2012, as you know, one of the first states. But we passed it with our leadership very, very skeptical about it. And so the governor was a very strict enforcer, and the legislature passed many aggressive regulations. Well, that has now passed, because for the most part, I can't say of all the legislature in general, but this governor is an advocate of commercialization, and he will help it in terms of, say, its money and banking issues, and obviously there's pressure at many levels to just allow more usage in general. And finally, I'd say there's an anti-Tabor movement out there. Partially it reflects a little more liberalization in terms of we need more money for all these programs. Partially it's because we've got some big surpluses, but I wouldn't be surprised if I see a cap moving down the road, or some changes, a timeout, or some changes in the caps. They have to be, as you know, voted on, but I wouldn't be surprised if that's moving down the road. And finally, I end with a picture that many of you have seen, and now I'll have to have one more governor added to it, but everybody's pretty healthy there. They're still, they assembled at the state capitol to raise some money to keep up the, not the state capitol, but at the mansion, to raise some money to improve the mansion. But there's that 1974. Remember, Wayne Aspinall went out in 72. He lost a primary. So that was that change that took place at that time. It was pretty dramatic, but it never really went to the legislature. So I would say today it's even more dramatic in terms of what could come out in terms of public policy. The Republicans were almost entirely in charge in '02 here. That was the zenith of Republican power in terms of the control of the legislature, dominant in the congressional wing, Governor Owens, obviously. Then the Democrats came back, gangbusters, a huge swing. Usually these swings used to take about 20 years. Now they happen within 4 or 5 years. They're just sort of amazing. Our politics has become so volatile, sort of like our stock market. And the Democrats, the zenith of their control was in '08 with Ritter, Salazar, Udall, go down the list. And then finally, we have been in divided government, but it is not very divided today. At the moment, Cory Gardner sort of stands out there as the one Republican that's in office. Obviously, there's some congressional folks, but they don't dominate. So that is a pretty quick rundown of what I think is happening in the states, some of the biggest issues, and also the shift that is taking place nationally. We're still, on one of my slides I had nationalization and polarization. What that says is if you're trying to be a moderate, like let's say, for example, Michael Kaufman, it is hard to be a moderate. We are so polarized that if you try and compromise, as Cory's trying to, say, for example, you get criticism on both sides. It is hard to get away from the national politics because it's so nationalized. Cory is trying to, and Mike Kaufman was trying to get some distance between him and the president, and that's hard to do. He's a dominant figure, and these elections tend to be all about the presidency, whether you approve or disapprove. So that's one reason why watching what's happening in Washington and trying to possibly make it better than it is. In terms of you're encouraging compromise, you're encouraging House members and Senate members that are willing to work across the aisle is so important. It's also to keep in mind what you don't want to happen in Colorado. You want to do everything you can to see, well, kind of the comedy that we saw this morning between these folks, because the question is, from my mind, will there be forbearance? Because while the Democrats have pretty much overwhelming control, can they say, well, we should maybe do this, but not do this? Or maybe that's too far, let's do that later. It needs more education, et cetera, et cetera. Hickenlooper used to do that. And I think Jerry Brown did that. I know we all think Jerry Brown is a wild-eyed guy from the 1970s. Actually, he was the adult in the room for a lot of the most recent years in the California legislature. So that's kind of what's in my mind, and I think is going to be important as we move down the road. With that, I will stop. I think we're ready for a transition here.
Yes, great. Thank you, Floyd. Please give Floyd Cerulli Associates a warm hand. Thank you. Floyd, as always, great to have you here, and your insights very much appreciated.